Dr. DC podcast. My name is Dr. DC, and it's just me. Richard is back from Italy, but due to a sort of wacky scheduling this week, despite being back, we didn't have time to record this episode. So it's just a solo dolo this week. Richard is around. He will be back. You've already heard him on the double. You'll hear him on the double this week too. We'll get him back to the main feed. You know, it's a tougher sell, let's be honest. Each week, we talk about the weird and wonderful world of DC while fielding questions from listeners like you. And what more appropriate theme could we have for an episode where I've been ghosted by my co-host than ghosts? We're talking about ghosts, specters, phantoms. Those are charged words in DC. We're talking about all of that kind of stuff this week. It's Doctober. Happy Halloween. And as you know, Doctober is when we talk about the spooky things. And so just fucking sad by myself. I guess we'll just fucking talk about ghosts. All right. We got a bunch of questions, so why don't we just hop right on in, since obviously this is a no banter episode because I'm by myself and I'm fine about it. We're going to Facebook. Go do the face and the book. Go do the Facebook. And the first question comes from Kyle Sauvi, who asks, is there a DC equivalent to Marvel's Ghost Rider? And remember, kids, beware the gray ghost. So first of all, Gray Ghost, great reference from Batman the Animated Series. If you haven't seen it, there's a really great episode where basically the Gray Ghost was this like sort of pulp hero, like a noir detective kind of figure that Bruce loved his movies when he was a kid. And then as Batman, he ends up investigating crime adjacent to that, and he ends up teaming up with the Gray Ghost. But the real thing here is that it's Adam West voicing the Gray Ghost. It's a great episode. So if you've never seen it, go check that out. So the actual question, though, is there a DC equivalent to Marvel's Ghost Rider? So again, you know, this ain't the Mr. Marvel podcast, so I'm taking a slight stab in the dark about my knowledge of Ghost Rider. But from what I understand, the two things that I think I know about Ghost Rider: one, he has a skill called the penance stare that I think like sends your soul to hell or some shit like that. Like he finds the thing you're guilty of and like sets you on fire and your soul goes to hell or some shit like that. But the other thing is that Ghost Rider works for Satan, does he not? Or Mephisto or whatever the fuck in Marvel, right? He's working for hell, right? Reaping souls and of bad people and stuff like that. I believe. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong there. So there's kind of two sides to this. I would say on the penance side of things, the obvious version would be the Spectre. You know, we're talking about a spirit chained to, you know, the cosmos, to celestial right and wrong. Ghost Rider is referred to as the spirit of vengeance, I think so. And so is the Spectre. He's the spirit of God's vengeance. So this seems like an obvious connection, an obvious correlation. The Spectre finds the thing that you're guilty of. There's always some sort of like poetic justice, horrifying magic kind of punishment. So, I mean, that's probably the closest. The fundamental difference, though, is that Ghost Rider is, like I said, I'm pretty sure Ghost Rider works for hell, whereas the Spectre works in service of God. Now, we could go one step out of here and just say, like, well, but God's got a plan for everything, and that includes hell, which is a fucking cop-out. But, you know, we could say that. But I think fundamentally the big difference between them is the who are they reporting to. But like, the other bit I don't know is, I don't know if Ghost Rider, like if the characters that are Ghost Rider, I don't know if they're dead and then they become this thing. Like, obviously the Ghost Rider is a position that multiple people can fill in because there have been a couple. But I don't know if it's like you die and then your soul gets bound to it, because that's the deal with the Spectre, right? The Spectre is the spirit of God's vengeance bound to the soul of a human ghost, basically. Every host of the Spectre is dead. That goes for Jim Corrigan, goes for Hal Jordan, Crispus Allen, relatively recently Darkseid. That's just how that works. So I don't know if that's the case with Ghost Rider, but I think more or less that feels like the closest that DC's got, the closest version to something like that, I think. All right, we're leaving Facebook and we're heading on over to Threads. Threads. And a question from Mr. E64, who asks, what's the deal with Ramakrishna? Does she just exist to be Deadman's boss, or does she actually do stuff in the DC universe? So, yeah. So Ramakrishna, as the question pointed out, is connected to Deadman. So, Deadman, Boston Brand, he's an acrobat who is shot and killed, and his spirit is not allowed to pass into the afterlife. It's sent back by this spirit Ramakrishna, by this god Ramakrishna, sent back to balance the scales of karma. And he thinks that means find his own killer. It doesn't really. And essentially, I think it's not unreasonable to say that Rama is essentially the god of karma in at least on Earth, at least in DC. Now the spiritual place Nanda Parbat, which Deadman is stuck in again, in sort of recent comics. And, Nanda Parbat has been tied to a few different things, but it's generally a spiritual nexus. I think in Witching Hour, it's referred to as like part of the boundary between life and death. So in that sense, if we're talking about balance, karma, things like that, Ramakrishna is almost a little bit of like a fairy person, not like fairy like Fairy, more like Ferry. Person who sort of decides if the scales are balanced when a person dies, maybe. If Nanda Parbat serves that kind of role. But I think in general, it's maybe not necessarily about justice, but there is a sort of a karmic element to Ramakrishna. So, I think obviously is inspired by or possibly related to some kind of like Hindu deity, but I don't know enough about those gods to know like what it's borrowing from, or like which parts are right, which are made up, or is the name a real one, or is it like merging things to get like, I don't know enough about Hinduism for that. But Rama's definitely was meant to be from more of like kind of that kind of pantheon, which I think is interesting. Yeah, I mean, and outside of Deadman, I don't know that we encounter Rama a ton. Like she's very cloistered as a god character, more or less kind of only dealing with Deadman. I'm sure there's a couple of exceptions, but generally speaking, that's when you see Rama. But yeah, I think in general, kind of god of karma sort of idea. But again, you don't really see Rama a ton outside of Deadman stories. All right, we're leaving Threads and we're heading on over to Instagram. Now we're going to Instagram, take some questions and answer them. First question comes from Damn Jinkies, who asks, Why do all the ghosts in DC look so drastically different from each other? The gentleman ghost is invisible besides his clothes. Dead man can only possess people and can't be seen, etc., etc. Why is it so inconsistent? You're right. There's a few different versions of what a ghost kind of figure can look like. You're right about Gentleman Ghost. The other thing with Gentleman Ghost is most versions anyway, he's sort of translucent and all white, very ghosty, I think New 52 Gentleman Ghost was an exception to that, but yeah, generally kind of very ghosty looking. You're right. The Dead Man is interesting because we see him in full color, but he is not seen by other people. He has to possess someone. That's Dead Man's main ability, right? He's a ghost. He possesses people. He has to possess someone to be able to communicate with them to be seen. Now, there are some exceptions to that. Magic users could see and interact with Dead Man because they've got sort of, they have that ability. There are a couple of other characters that have a connection to Dead Man that are able to communicate with him, including sorry. Yeah, that's good for podcasting. Enormous yawn in the middle of the episode. Including Dove of Hawk and Dove. Boston Brand and Don Granger had a relationship, and they could communicate with each other without him possessing someone. So it does happen, but you're right. That's a different kind of ghost or spirit. There are, you could take a character like Marilyn Moonlight, who is sort of like a ghosty figure from like the Old West, who has made appearances recently in Superman or in Action Comics, in one of those. But Marilyn Moonlight manifests just looking like a regular person, and people can see them and they interact with the world and things like that. So you're right in that there is not one way to be a ghost in DC. But by the same token, I would say it's not just the way you appear or interact with the world, it's that there's multiple different kinds of coming back as a ghost. I think Gentleman Ghost is interesting because he's kind of bound by a curse. Gentleman Ghost's origins tied to Hawkman and Hawkgirl. And in one of their past lives, as Nighthawk and Cinnamon, these Old West characters, they were stopping Gentleman Jim Craddock, and he ends up being hanged, but I think for like a crime he didn't commit or something like that. And so there's this curse that his spirit will stick around until he can get revenge and the spirits of the people that killed him pass away, except that they don't. They keep reincarnating. So he's bound to the earth, and there's all sorts of weird shit about Hawkman and Hawkgirl and their souls and nth metal and magic and that. So, but he's literally bound to the mortal realm by his connection to Hawkman and Hawkgirl. Dead Man is sent back, but with a specific mission. So, the parameters are different. If part of the idea is like karmic retribution or whatever, it's, or tipping the balance and things like that, then him possessing people is supposed to give him like new perspectives, and he learns from them and things like that. And he has to do things in their lives to tip the balance, he's, as opposed to just like go in and fix everything. That's different, obviously. I guess where I'm going with this is I think, the Spectre is another one. That one is, there's a portion of the spirit of God, essentially, or at least the power of God, bound with a spirit. So that's an example where, like the specter can be invisible, can be ghostly, can be tangible, can be physical, can look human, can look monstrous, can do whatever. And that's just about the level of power. They can manipulate reality and do all sorts of crazy shit. So it has very little to do with just the idea of being a ghost. So I think the answer to your question is because there are different manners of coming back, different patron deities from which some of these ghosts may or may not receive their powers. There are essentially almost different rules each time you meet a ghost. And it sort of depends on those things. I would say even at that, though, there must be another ghost somewhere that is like bound to haunt someone. They might not look like Gentleman Ghost. I think you're right that from like a lore perspective, it would be neat if there was some consistency, but ultimately with comics, as we know, that's sort of a lost cause and not the spirit in which almost all of these things were created. We do a lot of work of jamming shit together later, to try to make it look like it's all one big tapestry, but it's really not. But yeah, I think a reasonable headcanon is just there are so many different types of spirits and ways of being a ghost that it's also reasonable that there are different ways that they manifest and show up and people can interact with them or not interact with them. Next question comes from Copy 801, who asks, if you could have the adventures of any other DC character as a ghost, who would it be? Pick a hero and a villain. So if I'm interpreting the question correctly, it's like just pick a character and then imagine they were a ghost and would you follow their adventures? I mean, a great version of this that happened, not great that it happened, but it was a sort of salvaging of it, is Ralph and Sue Dibny, right? Sue Dibny obviously is killed during Identity Crisis, which is like highly controversial as a story and even just as an act or just as a decision to kill Sue Dibny. Ralph ends up dying over the course of 52, so just post Infinite Crisis. He dies in that book. And then briefly we do see them afterwards essentially as ghost detectives. The two of them are off solving mysteries as ghosts. And I do kind of love that idea. And it's better for them to be alive and exist as characters. But there is a part of me that's like, it's kind of like the Oracle thing. Like, it sucks how Barbara got shot and paralyzed. But Oracle is a great thing that comes out of that. And I think that could have been the case for Ralph and Sue Dibny if it wasn't maybe so tainted subject and people weren't so mad about it for so long or whatever. It might have been interesting to keep them dead, and then have them be ghosts and do ghost detective stuff. And, I don't know. I think that's fun, like a married husband and wife do detective stuff. That was always, I don't know. There's something about that I enjoy. So as for the question, what's a different character, pick a hero and a villain that I would want to see like a similar kind of thing from, is interesting. Who would I follow as a spirit? I mean, maybe this is just my prejudice, not prejudice, but my preference for kind of detective-y characters. But I actually think like Martian Manhunter would work well as a spirit, or, like especially maybe a different kind of spirit. Like if he's sort of his psychic resonance sort of stays out in the world after his physical body dies or something. From what I've read from the solicitation of the upcoming Absolute Martian Manhunter, I wonder if that's kind of an idea they're messing with, but something like that might be kind of interesting. A ghost adventure for a villain. I guess I would be interested in, Ooh, what's a villain ghost adventure I would like? I guess I would want to see... Shit, that is tricky, isn't it? Yeah, let's see. The continuing adventures of... Tough question with a villain, because in general, I'm not necessarily a big fan of just like... Or I gotta find the way to phrase this. There are plenty of good times where like a villain gets a story and you follow it and you read it and it's good. Like their own title, I mean, and it's good. But there's still something, I don't know, I'm just like very old school. There's still something would be like, we shouldn't give the Joker a book, you know, not just the Joker, but just like there's something weird about following the villain because then you almost have to make them not the villain, you know. So it works with some characters better than others. But I guess, Ghost Adventures of... Ghost Adventures of, let's call it... oh, I know. Yeah, sorry. I've got one now. We'll do Ghost Adventures of Gorilla Grodd, I think. When Grodd dies, something happens, and then as a ghost, you know, maybe being a ghost is the great equalizer, you know, like Grodd always has this thing about ape superiority, or, you know, or he sees humans purporting their own superiority. And when you're a ghost, you're all just sentient spirits. It's the great equalizer. Your physical form your genetic makeup has kind of nothing to do with it. So maybe Grodd Adventures as a ghost would be a piece of character development for him or something like that. Yeah, let's say that. Next question comes from Alfred is Zaddy, who asks, of all the people Deadman has possessed, what experience was the most awkward? There's been multiple instances where Deadman possesses Batman, and they do a thing where it's either like, my God, his mind is so disciplined, he's kicking me out, you know, like where Batman's trained himself to not get possessed or whatever the fuck. We see that. That's less awkward and more just kind of funny. Maybe the most awkward is, I mentioned that Boston Brand and Dawn Granger, Dove, were in a relationship, and there was this kind of thing where he would keep possessing bodies and be like, hey, now I'm like here in the physical world. And Dove was like, this weirds me out. I don't like it. And Boston was like, but it was fine in Wonder Woman 1984. And Dove goes, was it fine there? So I think that one is kind of an awkward one. You know, how do you be in a relationship with someone that can't manifest physically? If their primary ability is just taking over other people, essentially robbing them of agency and free will, like that's sort of a weird, bad situation, I think. That's maybe the most awkward, version. He's had some painful bad ones, like he was possessing Black Lanterns during Blackest Night. He has, like I said, possessed Batman. He possessed Etrigan one time, and that's its own tricky thing between there being Jason Blood and the demon Etrigan. He's possessed quite a few characters over the years. You know, I think in some versions, because Boston Brand, like, even by this name, you kind of know, like, yeah, it's me, I'm a trapeze artist, Boston Brand. Like, I think every once in a while he'll, like, possess a woman and be like, whoa, I'm a real babe now. Like, they used to do shit like that with him, I think. But I think the most awkward is probably trying to date someone through other people's bodies. Looking at you, Ghost, the movie. Ghost, great movie. Next question comes from Robbie's Just This Guy, who asks, there's that haunted tank, but do any ghosts get to live in a cool robot body? So the haunted tank, we've talked about this before. It's a tank haunted by like an old Confederate general, and like his descendant can like see it and see him or whatever. Like he gets, yeah, it's it's weird. Confederate general ghost in a tank in like World War II or whatever. Very weird premise. Very, it feels like fraught territory, something difficult to sort of wade into, especially now. As far as a ghost being trapped in a robot body, the first one that comes to mind, it's maybe not 100% a ghost, but it is like a spirit, is that there was a whole thing for a bit with Red Tornado in which, the reason that Red Tornado, beyond just being an android, had these wind powers is that the android was like suffused with the being and the essence of this like wind god, wind spirit, wind entity called Ulthun, which was like an alien spirit or being. And they get combined, or Tio Moro captures it and uses it on Red Tornado or whatever. But it interacts with the android kind of body and everything. And for a while they were like, and that's where the powers come from. And then there's a sort of like, what's the identity sort of thing. I think we tend to more or less drop and forget the Ulthun of it all with Red Tornado. We just go, Tio Moro built a tornado robot to infiltrate the Justice League. And then it became an actual hero and like countered its programming or whatever. And in some ways, I think that's more interesting to just go like the Data route, where it's like this being is more than the sum of what it was built for. But for a while there, this literal idea of like merging like an essence, like an actual like spiritual entity, and this like cold robotic, android shell was a real thing. And Ulthun as Red Tornado is essentially the exact thing that you're talking about. I'll be honest, I don't think Ulthun has even been mentioned in a comic I've read in the last 20 years. But it's in there, and you know how comics are, and things are cyclical, and someone will be like, I fucking love the Ulthun era. Someone will bring it back in some way. But yeah, I mean, that's a very close version of this thing that we're talking about. Next question comes from, oh fuck, gotta do this by myself. Hang on. Gotta get a sip of water in here. All right, I'm ready. Next question comes from ABC Brooks. Easy as 1, 2, 3 Brooks. Simple as do, re, mi Brooks. ABC Brooks. 1, 2, 3 Brooks. Baby, you and me Brooks. 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 ABC Brooks asks, what is nth metal? Why can it hurt or make Gentleman Ghost tangible? And was it Morrison that referred to it as the metal of imagination? So, as you know, there are many metals in DC that have different varying properties and whatnot. And when we talk about the metal events, those crisis level events, Dark Knight's metal, Dark Knight's death metal, it's not just about the aesthetic. They actually vaguely, bring the idea of these metals into it. So some of those metals include like promethium, electrum, a few things like that. And then when you get to the higher tiers, they're more and more conceptual. So the eighth metal is like the metal of the gods. Things like the God Killer sword that Deathstroke had, that kind of is tied to Wonder Woman and stuff like that. That's the eighth metal. The nth metal is this metal that sort of bridges the physical realm and the metaphysical. So nth metal has a number of properties. We see this metal used by Hawkman and Hawkgirl, and its number one ability for them is that it is gravity nullifying. It has anti-gravity properties, so nth metal can make you fly. Their wings give them their precision or whatever, but the nth metal just will let you float or fly. Nth metal is also a psychic metal. It bonds to you and responds to you psychically. So sometimes that's used as how they make their wings come and go. And sometimes it's, Onimar Sin, a character from Thanagar, who is has mastery level control of nth metal, can do shit with it that Hawkman and Hawkgirl could never do, or Hawkwoman could never do. So it's a psychic metal. It responds that way. And one of its other properties is that it's like magic nullifying. So Gentleman Ghost, who we've talked about already, is a Hawkman and Hawkgirl villain. And their maces and the things that they have that are made of nth metal can actually make physical contact, can disrupt his magical abilities, the ability of him as like a spirit to phase in and out of like physical reality. We've seen that in other media too, like in Justice League Unlimited, there's a very sad story where Grundy is like brought back from the dead, but made like a soulless killing machine. He's not just like the actual Grundy, and only Hawkgirl can put him down, but they were friends and stuff like that. But she has to do it because of her mace and all this kind of stuff. And it's a very like sad episode, a good story. But again, we're bringing it back to that idea of the magical nullifying powers of nth metal. The final thing here. So 8th metal, 9th metal, what is referred to in Dark Knight's metal, and possibly also in Final Crisis, but to be honest, I don't remember. Actually, it might also be in Final Crisis, is that there is this Element X, which was the thing that like powers Metron's Mobius chair and stuff like that. It's it's mentioned here and there. But that Element X is the 10th metal. It's the metal of creation. It's the metal of, creation's the only way really to put it. At the end of Dark Knight's metal, the Justice League with Element X saves the multiverse, raises it up out of the dark, and they accidentally break the source wall with it because it's so powerful. So I think, that's kind of more in the realm of like what that thing is that, Element X, you could make the argument is maybe what the World Forger would use to make worlds, it's the metal of creation, or imagination as you put it or whatever. Nth metal is a little less metaphysical, but it does interact with spirits and ghosts and magic and psychic powers and things like that. So it's like starting to bridge that gap. Obviously, the 8th metal, like the god metal, must have some sort of magical adjacent properties because it comes from the sort of sphere of the gods and things like that. But yeah, essentially, nth metal can affect Gentleman Ghost because it nullifies magic. And the thing I think you're referring to is Element X, the 10th metal. So that's it for Instagram. Let's go over to Reddit, where everyone's nice and no one's ever mean. And our first question comes from Arpit the Hero, who asks, can you please explain the Green Lantern ghosts we've encountered so far, like the Emerald Space visited by Hal, or the dead Green Lantern ghosts communicated by Simon Baz in the Geoffrey Thorne run, or John's mother and sister in the current run? So, couple of things here. I've been reading Green Lantern. I get Green Lantern books as they come out. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't remember the Emerald Space. I'll also be honest with you. That Geoffrey Thorne run, I was not hating on it from the beginning like a lot of people were. And I think it did a couple of interesting things, including set up our current status quo of the Green Lanterns being not run by the Guardians anymore, but run by the United Planets. But I gotta be honest with you, that Thorn run lost me. It was too much for me. Really hard to follow. I thought it was very chaotic, really difficult to sort of scan what was happening issue to issue and keep up with it. But I'm going to throw out a sort of half guess, but half based on canon sort of thing here. So if there are dead Green Lantern ghosts being communicated with by Simon Baz in that run, I think the key to that is that we're talking about Simon Baz. So Simon is a new Green Lantern that came around during the New 52 era. And if you'll recall, he had a couple of abilities that we didn't really see from Green Lanterns before. He was like a healer. He could use the Green Lantern ring to like heal illnesses and wounds and stuff like that. And he also had this thing called the Emerald Sight that was a little bit like Foresight kind of power that Simon had that other Lanterns did not. I think it's not a crazy expansion or extrapolation of that if there's any way through the power of the Green Lantern Central Power Battery or just will or whatever, or through the Book of Oa, that he gets a glimpse of a future or of the future or whatever, that some similar mechanism would enable him to communicate with the consciousness or the spirits of deceased Lanterns. You know, we got to remember the rings are complicated technology. They are technology, but they're not just technology. Malthusian rings are extremely weird devices, and some are more sentient than others, and they respond to the wearer and that, and they are also supercomputers, and they're also conduits and portals to the Book of Oa, and they're also, they're channeling power in a wireless way. Like, the rings aren't plugged into the batteries of the lanterns or things like that. So there's quite a lot going on in a lantern ring. You can go into a lantern ring. We've seen it in Blackest Night. We've seen it in the Morrison Sharp run on the Green Lantern. There's all sorts of things happening in there. It's a real simple, I think, step to say that some version of consciousness or whatever could exist as a ghost. I don't know if I can't remember from the run. I don't know if we're actually talking to ghosts or if we're just talking to things that look like ghosts but appear as lantern constructs. But we know that your constructs can be built off things in your subconscious that you don't have to literally puppet them. Like when Hal or someone or Bruce or anyone wears a ring and they make their parents show up or whatever. Sometimes they say like fucked up shit to them. That's their subconscious manifesting. It's not Hal being like, and now I am willing my dad to say I'm not good enough. Like, that's not what that is. So for Simon Baz, who already seems to have maybe a more, or rather not a more, but a different connection with the ring and its relationship to time and also to how it conveys information. Not crazy that Simon would be able to communicate in that way. As far as the ghost of John Stewart's sister specifically, I would say, in this current Green Lantern War Journal run, John has had an upgrade. He is not just any Green Lantern. He's essentially a Guardian now. He has a level of power somewhere between very powerful Green Lantern and like God. And because of that, he's able to do stuff more easily. I won't say he's able to do stuff other Lanterns can't do, but he can do it in a way that they can't manage, or that comes easier to him than it does to them. So He goes off on this adventure in space, but his mom has like dementia and stuff like that. And he basically makes a construct of his deceased sister who died when they were kids to keep his mom company, because she is, again, because of the dementia, she's like, oh, where's your sister or whatever. And he does that. And then this construct, even when John is like in a pocket dimension in an outside time and space, and he's dealing with stuff from the first world, like Urgrund and whatnot, this construct is still on Earth at home, acting, making decisions, having agency, protecting this mom from these, like, you know, what are they called? The fucking, shit, what are they called? God, like the Radiant Dead. That's what it is. The Radiant Dead. Protecting her from them. And it's not John, again, willfully manipulating all the actions. This construct has sort of been imbued with his remembered characteristics of the sister as a personality, and then it is making decisions based on that, but also based on knowing that it's a construct and having access to it. Like, it's actually kind of fucked up. I think you would be hard pressed to distinguish it from actual life. You know what I mean? Like, when we think of like that Measure of a Man episode of Star Trek, you go like, how do you prove that something is sentient? And Picard's thing is like, prove that I'm sentient. And the guy's like, but you are. And he goes like, prove it. Like, you're just saying that I am, because that's what we say about ourselves, but like, prove it. And I think if you did that with this construct, you would be in a Measure of the Man situation. But like I said, that's a function of John being more powerful than almost any other Green Lantern. Or I mean, he is more powerful than them, but, you know, Hal gets to Hal around. But that's what that is. So, in a sense that, I mean, it's not really a ghost. He didn't raise his sister from the dead, but the memory of them and how he animates that makes them a sort of ghost. And, you know, it's I'd say slightly ambiguous gray area. Like, it is not the spirit of his sister, definitively. But it is so alive and based on his sister that it's almost a Ship of Theseus situation too. You know, this is almost a White Vision kind of thing. If the spirit of his sister came back and they both talked to each other, which is what, you know what I mean? So that's kind of interesting. Next question comes from Acknowledge Me, who asks, what are some of the scariest stories from the Ghosts horror anthology? So Ghosts, just that word, was the title of a horror anthology series published by DC in like the 70s and 80s. You know, we've talked about these anthology series before, like House of Secrets, House of Mystery. You know, the DC Horror Presents, The Witching Hour. There were all sorts of horror comics. Ghosts was an anthology and had lots of one-off stories. It, for a short run, was the home of some stories featuring Dr. 13. And I think even like the Spectre and some characters like that, maybe Phantom Stranger, would show up in Ghosts in a series of stories. I'll be honest, I have not read many stories in Ghosts. I would say I don't, any one that I have read, I haven't found particularly scary, but it is an interesting title in that did bring in some stories from the main continuity. It wasn't totally off in its own world. It did have things with Dr. 13, and I don't know if Dr. Occult was ever in there, but certainly Dr. 13, definitely the Spectre, possibly Phantom Stranger, maybe Deadman, made appearances in that Ghosts anthology, which is kind of cool. All right, we're leaving Reddit. We're heading on over to the doc score. Hang on. Hang on. I've got this. We're going to Duck Scored tonight. Duck Scored. Scoring ducks. Unapologetic when in Duck Ups the Scored. Jesus. Really tripping across the finish line there. Boy, oh boy. Next, this first question from the Duck Scored comes from We've Only Just Damn Done, who asks, how much more of Xantha Zhao would you like to see? How big of a role do they have as a spirit envoy? What team-ups would you like to see? So, this is part of, there were a couple of different books that launched at the same time. One was City Boy, which I don't know if City Boy is like canonically connected to Jack Hawksmoor, but it's like that idea of like person that communicates with cities. There was the Vigil, which was like a Indian or like South Asian super team that sort of operated clandestinely, which was interesting. And then there was a book called Spirit World, and that one featured Xantha Zhao, and I have not, unfortunately, read much Spirit World. However, I've encountered this character because they show up during Absolute Power, and they're with Constantine and some stuff like that. So basically, as a spirit envoy, this character helps kind of, again, the ferryman sort of idea, but they can step in and out of the spirit world. I think they can summon different weapons and things like that. They've obviously got like I think a Chinese background. I should read it. I just haven't gotten around to it, and I haven't seen the collected edition yet. And it didn't make my pull list. I was getting the Vigil, but I wasn't getting this one. Because I can only get so much because I'm trying to be a responsible human that I can pay his bills and things like that. I definitely want to learn more about them. I want to read more of them. I think the opportunity of stepping in and out of the spirit world is an interesting one. It's a thing that I like, even if it's not 100% like true. Like where I'm going with this is there's that, the Veitch run of the question where he sort of does the transcendental kind of meditation thing. He like takes some drugs and he's like, Metropolis is speaking to me. And I do kind of love the idea of a foot in a different plane of existence, and whether you're accessing it drug wise or by actually cutting a portal open to the spirit realm or things like that. I'm always into that idea. So I think that's really cool stuff. Yeah, and I like the idea of it's not just a person that can do it, but they've got a job, your spirit envoy. I think that might also, I might be getting this wrong here. They might actually be a spirit who then comes to the real world. But at any rate, I love that idea. So yeah, if I get my hands on a collected edition, I will. I would love to see them show up more. I was pleasantly surprised to see them in Absolute Power because, I feel like the Vigil really disappeared in a way that I didn't love because I was interested in them. City Boy feels like such a connection to like Jack Hawksmoor and the Authority and like Wildstorm stuff, even just in concept. And I'm pretty sure maybe has been mentioned. Maybe it was in Absolute Power or in something else. Someone was talking about the Century Babies and all this kind of shit. So I think City Boy had like maybe a little bit more to grab onto there. But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised to see the Spirit World sort of crossover happen in Absolute Power. Would love to see more. Next question comes from the Overmat, who asks, which DC characters do you think would opt to stick around as a ghost after death? Opt to. Interesting. opt to is a funny way of phrasing it, because I also think there are some characters that like opt is technically the right word because it's about their choice, but opt feels very passive. Like, here's where my head's at. If you're thinking of someone like Bruce, who, obviously it would be, if we ever killed Bruce, if he died and he wasn't coming back and it wasn't a Final Crisis situation or something like that, if we were actually done with Bruce Wayne, what you would want to see is him die, and in his last moments he's either being super fucking brave or he's being super fucking fatherly, and he's like, I'm so proud of you, blah blah blah, whatever. If he stuck around as a ghost, what you would want to see, I think, is the like, I was just making sure you'd be all right, but I think it's time for me to go. Like, you're in good hands. Like, it'd be that kind of thing, and then he would sort of gracefully walk into the light. But I think we all know that that's not how Bruce works. That's what we would want for him, because it would be like he finally did it. He's let go of the bat. He knows that the mission's good. He's done his best with his folks. He's gone. But we all know that what Bruce would really do is like, oh, so I'm dead, am I? Not for fucking long. And he'd be a ghost, and he'd train himself how to dead man so he could possess someone, so he could build a machine so he could de-ghost himself. Like, he would fucking, like, Bruce would not rest. So when you say opt to stick around, I feel like compelled is like the word. Like, Bruce wouldn't be like, yeah, I guess I could go to my eternal reward, but why would I do that? So that's the first thing that sort of comes to mind that way. Stick around as a ghost. I feel like I would want to see maybe characters that like you don't want to see separated. Like Fire and Ice, or like, I mean, I know they did this before, but like it was so heartbreaking. But like Beetle and Booster, it would have undercut, I think, Ted's death to have his ghost just sticking around and whatever. But now that we're past that, and Ted is back, and Beetle and Booster are a thing again, and we're just past that era. If one of them died, I'd want them to stick around. Just be like, just because I'm dead doesn't mean that I'm like the good times are done, or like, you know what I mean? Like, characters that are like that, I think I would like that. I feel like maybe Green Arrow maybe also slightly fits that bill. Maybe a little less of a compel situation as Bruce, but that idea of like, I'll stick around and watch out for you kind of thing. He'd opt to stick around, I think, as a ghost. Those are my thoughts. I mean, the other one too is like magic characters. I think magic characters know too much about how the sausage is made, and maybe don't see heaven or hell as a particular comfort to them. So like a character like Zatanna might die and just be like, it would be better to just be a fucking ghost than to go to either of those fucked up places, right? I think magic characters know too much to be happy with the afterlife. That's my feeling about that. All right. Next question comes from Mars, who asks, is there any equivalent to a Force Ghost in DC? Maybe somehow tied into the green or the red? I mean, right away, you've nailed it, I think. But that idea of the Force Ghost, I think it's important to establish what is actually happening with the Force Ghost. And this is the thing that, like, Star Wars also had to take time to explain to us, because it was a hazy idea that had to get refined over iterations, and as other, books and movies and video games and things like that were made canon or uncanon or whatever. So here's the thing with a Force Ghost. Not every Jedi just gets to be a Force Ghost. In fact, almost all Jedi ever don't get to be Force Ghosts. When Jedi die, they kind of, their essence, their life rejoins the Force, even if they die peacefully, even if they die in meditation, and their consciousness is dispelled and their energies return to the Force, essentially. They become one with the Force. So they stop existing as an individual and they join with the Force. We see a version of this in DC with the Speed Force too, I think, where you sublimate to the Speed Force or to the Source if you're like a new god or something like that. You don't retain your individual consciousness unless it manifests again. So here's the thing with the Force Ghost. Qui-Gon Jinn, part of the reason that he was sort of excluded by the Jedi Council in his time was because he was a believer in the living Force, where the Jedi had become increasingly dogmatic. Qui-Gon was very kind of he believed in the living Force, in it as a entity that you listen to and, you know, move with it and stuff like that. You don't try to constrain it to your rules, even if your rules are quote unquote good. You take your guidance from the Force. And because of this and Qui-Gon's approach, because he was less dogmatic than most of the rest of the Jedi, even though he dies in battle and unexpectedly, even for him, you can check the surprised look on his face, he manages to retain his consciousness when he joins with the Force. He becomes one of very few Jedi that can manifest themselves from the Force with their own individuality and consciousness intact. So he then teaches that to Yoda, to Obi-Wan Kenobi. And then, we sort of skip over some of it, but anyone that learned it since learned it from them. But it was sort of either a lost practice, a lost art, or one that really hadn't been done. So all that to say, we're talking about retaining your consciousness while joining into a greater collective consciousness, collective life energy. So bringing up something like the green or the red, you're absolutely right. So these are the parliamentary kingdoms of different aspects of life, right? The green is the collective consciousness of all plant life. The red is the collective consciousness of all animal life. These things operate in some ways like the Force, not in that it's like telepathy or whatever, but it's like these things are bound together in a sort of physical way, but also in this sort of spiritual, ethereal way. Now, we know the green chooses an avatar to become the Swamp Thing, right? But we also know that Alec Holland was not the first Swamp Thing. There were many before him. We also know he's not the last one. Levi Kamei is the newest Swamp Thing. So what happens to Swamp Things when they're done? Well, they join the Parliament of Trees. And for a time, they retain their own individual consciousness, even as members of the Parliament. But then over time, the let's call them parliamentarians eventually kind of pass into they lose their individuality, they lose their connections to humanity, they stop speaking, they just become part of the collective web of plant life again. In some ways, I think you nailed it in that the green is like an almost perfect, parallel to the Force in DC. You see this sort of thing in Tolkien in a slightly different way, in which when we talk about the Ents are not trees, right? They are tree-ish because over time they spend so much time with trees, because they're guardians of trees and stuff like that. They become increasingly tree-ish. And as they grow weary and old, as the world ages and that, they grow more and more tree-ish. And we know there are Ents that become so tree-ish, they can no longer move, they can no longer speak. They, what's another example? It's like the live action remake of Beauty and the Beast, where they add another layer to their curse, which is that if he doesn't learn to love when the last petal falls, they're not just stuck that way. They become just the fucking objects, which is so much harsher. But I do think there is that idea of individual consciousness versus, being part of some sort of greater kind of whole thing. I think you're right. The green and the red are probably the closest version of that to the Force that there is in DC, but I will say the Speed Force also is like that. There are speedsters who can join the Speed Force and lose themselves. And we've seen interpretations of that where they lose their consciousness or whatever. Now, because it's comics, they get it back or whatever. They come back. But essentially the idea is for those conduits, as they've been called recently in Flash comics, they sort of could you could theoretically sublimate to the Speed Force, lose all individual identity, and become part of the sentience of the Speed Force when you die as a speedster. Many of them don't do that because they're stubborn and they're fucking superheroes, but you could do that. So the Speed Force is another version, even with the word in it, that is not dissimilar to the idea of the Force in Star Wars. All right. Last question comes from Butt, who asks, does the Spectre count as a ghost? So the Spectre itself, as mentioned, is a fragment of the power and the spirit of God, it's God's vengeance, and only God's vengeance, given form. It has a name that I don't remember. It starts with an A. It's like, it's not Azazel, but it's like one of those kind of things, right? But it's also not, it's not really a thing unto itself, like when the power of the Spectre is in Day of Vengeance, Black Alice, a character who can siphon the powers of other characters, siphons the Spectre's power. And at that time, the Spectre is not bound to a human host. So it's just the spirit of God. And when Black Alice siphons the power of the Spectre, they still can't kill it because he essentially becomes nothing. He is only the power. There's very little left of him. Like, you can't interact with it. You can't stab it. You can't banish it. It's not a thing. So I think it's inaccurate to call it a ghost. If you listen to the Ghost Facers podcast where we were talking about supernatural, that a ghost still has a soul. It just hasn't moved on to its sort of final rest or whatever. So in that sense, the Spectre is absolutely not a ghost because it doesn't have a soul of its own. It's just God's vengeance wandering around with no kind of connection. That's why it has to be bound to the soul of a human. Now, it's only ever bound to the soul of a deceased human. So in that sense, the Spectre with a host is partially a ghost because you're bound to a human soul that is deceased, that is spectral in some way. That is, by definition, a ghost. So the Spectre, just the entity itself, not a ghost. The Spectre as a full unit, when it's as a unit, when it's bound to a human host, is more or less a ghost. Yeah. I mean, fuck, we've talked about how Jim Corrigan became the Spectre, right? He doesn't just get fucking cement shoes. He gets put in a barrel filled with cement. He gets drowned in cement and then thrown into the fucking into the harbor. It's so fucked up. And that's from the 40s and shit. And that's how Corrigan dies and then gets bound to the Spectre. He's absolutely a ghost. Crispus Allen, absolutely a ghost. Hal Jordan, absolutely a ghost, etc., etc. So yeah, depends what you mean when you say the Spectre. That's all the questions for this week. Consider yourselves ghosted. So I'm not the only one who's been ghosted this week. You've been ghosted in that we've talked ghosts of this episode. October continues. One more week, and what would be scarier than Richard coming back to the main feed? Keep an eye out for the call for questions for that one. And you can send those questions to us wherever you find us, Dr. DC Podcast on all the social medias. You can email us. You know what to do. And also, if you're not already, give us some support on Patreon. Patreon.com/DrDC. There's a $1, $5, $7 level. They all give you access to the Discord, our awesome Discord fan community. And at the higher levels, you get bonus episodes. The imminent release of the newest Golden Age tier series, rewatch series, DC Review, where me and Dr. DC Sr., my dad, are going to go through the entire DC Extended Universe. But also at that tier, you can get Toretto Talks and Bonding Time and Cerebros. It all helps to support us, so go check that out. And if you already are doing all of that and you still want more of us, as I just mentioned, go check out Ghostfacers, a Supernatural rewatch. We're going through every single episode of the CW Supernatural. We talk about real world monster lore, behind the scenes stuff about the show. It's a great time. If you are a Canadian podcaster, get signed up at canpodawards.ca. It's nomination season, and you better believe we're going for it again. You can nominate the Dr. DC Podcast and Ghostfacers in a number of categories, in addition to a number of other awesome Canadian podcasts. So if you are a Canadian podcaster, get signed up. Get your nominations in. I think they got to go in by November 1st. So, we would love your support. And, we'll riot if you don't. That's it for this week. Adios.
This was a Brain Freeze podcast.